Welcome to Old Path Ministries and our study through the book of Ruth. We begin today, and we're going to get through just the first chapter because it's by the second chapter that everything becomes very recognizable to the what are kind of the types that we see introduced here to us in the book of Ruth. And I'll explain those a little bit in some of the big aspects of it. We'll get into it a lot more in chapter 2. Trying to do both first and second chapter because of the types makes it really kind of tough to try to do that all at one sitting. So the first study in this may be a little bit shorter. We'll go again, like I say, through the first chapter. But before we look at the text, I'll be putting up a map just to kind of give us an idea of where we're talking about, where Moab would be if you're not all that familiar with it, and then where they would have gone back to settle, where Naomi was ultimately from. But before we do that, let me make sure that I'm kind of careful with this to make mention of the book of Ruth being very, very often looked at almost in a mystical sense because of all of the symbolism that you find in it. And of course, you can read a lot of things into Old Testament passages and even New Testament passages by looking at symbols. And there's obviously a good reason for doing so, but then there are times that it could almost be taken to an extreme. And we do see that sometimes with the book of Ruth, that people will read things into it. Now, there is no question, none whatsoever, that there are types that are shown to us here in the book of Ruth, but they really are much older than the book of Ruth. And that's when we get to this man Boaz, and what he is as the kinsman redeemer, and how that points to knowing that Jesus would also be seen as a kinsman redeemer, but in a much, much different sense. But this is back in the law where the Goel would actually be that person, the one who would be the redeemer, the kinsman redeemer. And that's probably the most recognizable, if you will, of the types that we have in the book of Ruth, and we'll explain all of that when we get to chapter 2. What I want to do is look at a little bit of information in chapter 1, and it's kind of chapter 1 serves as the backstory. And as much as we get the history of it, there is so much that we genuinely don't understand fully about this. Really, the idea that Ruth is willing to leave everything of being from Moab to follow Naomi, and there must have been things that Naomi must have implanted, if you will, into the mind and into the heart of Ruth, that she would be willing to leave Moab, and understanding to some extent what that means. But it really needs to be stated up front. We see in the first few verses that this happened during the time of the judges. And the reason that they left in the first place and went to Moab is because things were happening in the nation of Israel that never should have been. So the first chapter really kind of begins with a whole series of this never should have happened. So if we look at that, there never should have been a famine in the land of Israel to begin with. We only need to read the first probably 9 or 10 verses of the book of Joshua to realize that God had promised, if they will keep their eyes on him, and if they will follow the law that he had given to them through Moses and that was continued on through Joshua, that the nation would be able to live in a way of prosperity. There would never be famine. And again, also, if you're going to leave the land because of famine, that just tells you right up front that there was a problem in the nation of Israel. They had turned their back on God. We saw that through the book of Judges. It's clear. Well, because of that, God had brought the nation to its knees in a famine. And rather than them waiting around for one of the judges, we see that Naomi's husband moves the whole group of them to Moab. This never should have happened. They never should have had anything to do with Moab. Moab was a kind of an off-limits group of people because of what had happened during the Exodus. And there was a real problem with that. They were never supposed to give their sons in marriage to the women of Moab and vice versa. They should never have had any interaction. Go back and read through Exodus and then through Numbers and Deuteronomy and look at the things that had taken place and why Moab was such a problem to the children of Israel. So they never should have married. The idea that Ruth never should have come into the family, it goes without saying. But this is also at the same time for us to remember that though you can have fine dealings with those people, at least in this case, but it wouldn't certainly be the majority of the time, Ruth is the exception, I absolutely believe. And all of this setup in chapter 1 is really outside of God's will, but it doesn't keep him from being able to use it. And one thing that we also see with Naomi's reaction, I think that we can agree that there is a bit of a problem that she looks at God as though he has done these things to her punitively. And if we step back and look at it in the big picture of things, if she was to come to God and say, it's not right, my husband died in Moab, my sons died in Moab, now I'm a widow, and my 2 daughters-in-law are widows as well. Why, God, have you done this to me? God's response could have been very easily, what were you doing in Moab? Why do you have pagan daughters? Why did you allow your sons to be married to women of Moab? And so their problems all stem from the same source, whether it's the people in Israel. During the time of the judges, they didn't do as God had instructed them in the first verses of Joshua. So Joshua dies. We know what ends up happening from that. There's no one to take Joshua's place like Joshua took that of Moses. And so people began to just do whatever seemed right to them. And it doesn't take very long using that course that things are going to go completely off the rails. Things are going to be a problem. Well, that's all very instructive to us as the church, mainly because what we can do, gleaning from Old Testament, we can look at this and say, great, we have a track record of what happens when God says, this is what is acceptable to me, only to have the people do things totally contrary to what God said was acceptable, and they do those things that are unacceptable, and then they have to deal with all of the consequences of it. That really, in really a very tight little circle, is kind of an overview of the times when this took place and why they were there in this position in the first place. Now, what this will also show us, especially when we get to Naomi and to Boaz, this really helps us in our understanding that God can use, even in those horrible times, there will still be those people who will look to him to have some kind of an understanding of just who he is. Let's remember kind of the chronology of this. Both Ruth and Boaz in Matthew chapter 1 show up in the genealogy of Jesus. And Ruth is one of those people, along with Rahab and one other, that show up in the genealogy of Jesus Christ. So it's pretty amazing. So what you have is Boaz, through Ruth, gives us Obed. And Obed gives us Jesse. Jesse gives us King David. So that's the line of succession. And then we know that through David comes Jesus the Messiah. All from the tribe of Judah. They're from Bethlehem. So we're getting close to Christmas time when everybody starts to think about Bethlehem and the birth of Jesus. And that was the city of David. But it was also the city of Ruth and Boaz. So when we go to Israel, I love looking at this. There are 2 perspectives that we usually stop and look at the area and the hills around Bethlehem, and to see where you just realize it's a very small place, that somewhere out in these places, these areas, is where these very same figures would have lived their lives and done the things that they had done while they were there. So pretty amazing. Well, Ruth chapter 1, let's turn there and let's have a word of prayer and we'll look at the text. Father, we thank you as we come to your word today. We ask that you would give us understanding ears and minds and hearts as we look through this, that you would give us skill in the understanding of what this text has to say, understanding the historical aspect of it, and how we might make proper application to what we read. And so we thank you. We give you all praise, and we ask that you would lead and guide us by your Holy Spirit, that we would understand what is put before us, that we would make that, again, right application. So we give you all thanks, and we praise you in Jesus' name. Okay, so chapter 1 of Ruth says, now, it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled. So that's why it helps us in our understanding of when this all happened. So this would be another one of those kind of almost like a parenthetical of showing to the nation an event that took place during that time with the judges. And in this case, what we have also, kind of like with the last three chapters of the book of Judges, the closeout of the era of history really kind of seems to culminate with Samson, but then they go back in those last chapters of Judges and give us some parenthetical, some things that happened during it. It's almost like an appendix to it. Well, this is very similar to the same thing, where this whole story of Ruth happens what seems to be in the earlier part of the Judges. Now, we find this happens sometimes where it's a book that is separate, and we kind of think, since books are separated, that there's a difference in the chronology. This is the same kind of thing that happens when you look through the major and the minor prophets. During the time of the major and the minor prophets, there were also the books that you could study during that time. If you start really kind of from Isaiah and then go to Malachi, so kind of the earliest to the latest, during that time is also the books like you can read of Esther and Ezra and Nehemiah. Those are all books from that era of history, but they're more seen as the historical books rather than the prophet books. So it's good for us to recognize that Ruth happens during the Judges. And that gives us, we're given that in the very first verse. So we see this. Now, the name of the man was Elimelech, which is basically our God is king. That's what his name means. And they ruled, the name of his wife was Naomi, and that just means pleasantness or delightfulness. So their names have meaning, of course. And then he had these two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, and they are Ephrathites from Bethlehem, or of Bethlehem. Now, Ephrath would have been the wife of Caleb. And so if you remember, that's where Caleb wanted to be, was in this area, that same Caleb that we know. We get that from 1 Chronicles. But that means basically, her name means fruitful. So when you talk about Ephrathah, we know that from the promise that the Messiah would come in the book. You find it in the book of Micah, that the Messiah would come out of Bethlehem. And so Bethlehem is house of bread, but it's also known by the person who it was named after, more than likely, the wife of Caleb, and her name means fruitful. So to say that a person is of Ephrathah or Bethlehem is really saying the same thing. They're just different names that are describing the area and why they are named as they're named. Okay, so it tells us of Bethlehem of Judah, and they were in the country of Moab, and they remain there. So that becomes the problem. There's a famine in the land, and so they go to Moab. These are all problems that are stemming from the same root, and that is that they had not been walking rightly before God at the time. Well, there's your problem. And so they wind up there where they did. It says then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left, and her two sons. Now they took wives of the women of Moab. Again, things that never should have taken place, that never should have happened. So what I want to do, again, let me put up I've done it already at the beginning. It would probably be best for you to have taken a screenshot. I should have probably mentioned that. But I'll add it in when you look at the map. I'll have a little something before that says take a screenshot of this. But if you go back and look at that particular map, you'll see where they would have more than likely, if you try to draw a straight line from Bethlehem to the area of Moab, you have to go across the Dead Sea. So more than likely they would have taken the northern route and gone actually over the top and then come down into Moab. Well, it tells us, so they took wives of the women of Moab, and the name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth, and they dwelt there about 10 years. So famine takes a while, but then again, they start to put down roots there in Moab, and of course, the sons now have married these women. Now, it doesn't say anything about how good the marriage was. We're not given any of those kind of details. So we would think that it was just kind of the common way of people starting families and all the rest of it, though it was outside of what God would have condoned. The idea that the children of Israel, of the tribes of Jacob, would never have had anything to do with anyone from Moab. There was some pretty wicked stuff that had taken place when they were in Moab coming through, and thousands were put to death because of all of the immorality and the intermarriage and the harlotry that took place by the women of Moab, and it was a way of trying to get God to curse the children of Israel. So you can go back and read all that. There's a lot of intrigue with the people of Moab, and so the fact that Naomi and her husband should be there in the first place is just obvious. They should never have been there. Now, verse 4, they took wives of the women of Moab, and so their names are given to us there. So then both, these are the two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, also died, and so the women survived 2 sons and her husband. So Naomi is left without sons and without a husband, and all she has now are these 2 daughters-in-law. Now, there's nothing in this that gives indication that either one of them was in any way unhappy, because they're both still at this place where they're by Naomi's side, but Naomi wants to give them an option. And so we see that in verse 6. And then so she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited his people by giving them bread. So the famine was broken, and Naomi gets word of it. There's nothing left for her in Moab. She has no family. She has nothing, and it's not even of her people. So she's at the point of kind of being brought, because of circumstance, to go back where she should be. She shouldn't be where she is now, but her 2 daughters are still with her. Daughters-in-law are still with her. So she hears that God has broken the famine, and she's going to head back. Therefore, she went out from that place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law were with her, and they went on their way to return to the land of Judah. So all 3 of them are still together at this point. So Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go and return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you, and as you have dealt kindly with the dead and with me." So this gives the impression that as it would have been in those times, that as a family would grow, in this case the sons were old enough to have daughters, they would still live as a family unit. Doesn't necessarily mean that they lived in the same room, but they would have lived in kind of a dwelling where they would all be present. So this gives the impression that everything is as it should be. And so the daughters were still devoted. They were devoted to their husbands. They're now devoted to their widowed mother-in-law. And the 3 of them are kind of a unit, but Naomi sees, this is where I'm going is not the place where you should go. You still have lives ahead of you. And she just is looking out for the best for these 2 girls. Everything about this has a real nice tenderness to it, though it's outside of God's will. So it is one of those things that we recognize that you can become comfortable not doing those things that God wants you to do, and God still has some amount of favor with upon them, and he has kept them and all that. But Naomi really does kind of see it for what it is. It's a very uncertain life when she gets back to Bethlehem. Doesn't know what's there, but she knows that that's her place of belonging. She should be there. Now, by that same token, if that is her place of belonging, then Moab is clearly the dwelling place. It's clearly the family background for both Orpah and also for Ruth. So technically, they're free to go back and remarry within the men of Moab and all that. So nothing would be outside of the norm here. It's not what God would have intended, but it is what it is. So Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, verse 8, "Go and return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me." So your husbands and with me, go in peace. Well, the Lord grant you that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. And so she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices, and they wept. And they said to her, "Surely we will return with you to your people." So there is the real recognition, even though they seem to have a real love for Naomi, and it's reciprocal, at the same time, they realize if they go, it's to something that is just as foreign to them as it was for Naomi to go into Moab. And so, it's very obviously it's a kind of a tugging at your heart type of a moment, needless to say. But Naomi does recognize this. Now, we're going to find when it comes to Ruth that there's a recognition that her parents are probably still very much alive. So what Ruth ends up leaving in order to stay by Naomi's side really does put a lot of weight behind her statement, Ruth's statement, when we get to verses 16 and 17. They're the very recognizable first chapter, iconic things that are said, and they're pretty profound when you really step back to see what they are. Now, it does give us the impression that Naomi was a witness to some extent of what it is that she believed and why she believed it. The girls would have had no idea, the women would have had no idea, because they were raised in Moab with all of its idolatry and its paganism. So remember, these are all the areas that when there was the split between Jacob and Esau, that this is where those descendants went. So I mean, there's still a lot of blood ties, but they went in completely different directions. And so that's still, oddly enough, that animus between those two parties still continues to this day. Well, this is in modern day Jordan, as you can see from the map that we put up a little earlier. Now, verse 11 says, "So Naomi said, 'Well, turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Are there still sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, and go, for I am old. I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, if I should have a husband tonight and should also bear sons, would you wait for them until they were grown?'" So there is a real recognition here of how the whole family dynamics went on. And so now they've brought themselves into that family. And Naomi says, well, first of all, I don't have a husband. I'm past the idea of childbearing, but even if I could do both, have another husband and get to the place of having sons, would you wait around for them long enough until they're old enough to be your husbands? So there is still that idea that the women would be able to pass from one son to another, even just in this hypothetical. It just gives you an idea of what it was like culturally. It's such a different time. It's such a different way of how things are here. But if you notice, this is Naomi just saying, I appreciate the idea that you're so concerned for me and that you want to spend your time with me. But let me just be very honest with you and let's be upfront. Let's look at this in the big picture. She says, if you're going to go with me, there's no husband in your future, because there's no husband in my future and there are no children in my future. So just realize that as I am widowed, you too are going to be widowed in the same way. So it's a pretty heavy thing. It's best that you go with that house where you were born into than to come into mine, which has no future for you. I mean, that's really the rationale that she's using with them so that they really fully understand. So in verse 14, so they lifted up their voices and they wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. What a cool thing this is. But notice the emotion that is here. Even in Orpah, who we know really nothing about, at this time and this junction, she realized the practical thing for her to do is to take that counsel. But the idea that they had become close enough is really kind of reflected right here in the text. There was a relationship that they had with their mother-in-law that was to them deep and it was abiding. Orpah goes back because, again, it is the practical thing to do. Ruth, on the other hand, though the question of pragmatism and practical ideas, it's not lost on her, but it's not what she wants. I think it's very cool and really impactful when you stop to consider it, because Ruth's whole point and what she ends up saying is incredibly, incredibly profound. Look at verse 15. So she said, "Look, your sister-in-law has gone," Naomi speaking here. "She's gone back to her people and to her gods." So there is a recognition of not only the people, but what kind of religious institution there would be and what it would be to follow. And this kind of also gives us an understanding of how much corrupted somewhat things were as far as Naomi was concerned, because as we understand the spiritual side of things, if we had two people putting ourselves in Naomi's spot, and if we were really dedicated to that, the last thing that we would want to see is pagans go back to their paganism, because we realize the outcome of that. The outcome of that is being found as an enemy of God, and that's a horrible, horrible situation to find yourself in. So if all things being equal and we were in that place, the last thing we would want to do, even though it might be good for their life here on earth, it's going to be horrible for their life in the eternal sense. So you don't want them going back to that. There's a lot of, again, you can see types and all the rest of it. And those really kind of hit their stride in the next chapter when we start to really look at types and things that are here. What this really does, first chapter, it more reflects the reality of what had happened to really a nation that had found itself in a place of rebellion, Israel. So a famine comes, which drives people out, and where they are driven is a place where they should never go, and their interaction with the people of Moab is a thing that should never have taken place, and now all this calamity has befallen them. So once again, you're going to see what Naomi has to say here. If she makes this, what is kind of a backhanded accusation against God, look at how you've dealt with me, God. Remember again, his reply could be, well, you shouldn't have been where you were. If you were really dedicated to me, even though there would be a famine in the land, God would have seen to their well-being if they had done what God had asked them to do. So all of that, let's just kind of stipulate to it, that's the condition of things. So she says, return like your sister-in-law. Do what she did, she says to Ruth. So in verse 16, Ruth said, entreat me not to leave you, or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. So verse 16 has this first bit of the things that she is willing to say. I will leave Moab behind. I'll leave my family. I will leave everything that I know that is of comfort to me, but I want to go where you're going. Now, in doing so, I don't know how much she really fully understood it, but to become from the children of Israel, which even seems in itself almost impossible because of what we see in Deuteronomy, the idea that someone from Moab could proselytize into Judaism seemed to be a very much forbidden kind of a thing. That would also be seen if Israel was doing what it was supposed to be doing during the time of Judges. This may have been a much more difficult thing, but let's remember, the children of Israel are in a place of just terrible, terrible compromise. The evidence of that? The famine. And the idea that God had said, I'll prosper you wherever you go if you will walk in a place of integrity before me. Again, the first verses in Joshua make that very, very clear. So God made the promise, walk with me, walk in a place of integrity, keep my law, keep my statutes, my commandments, and you'll prosper. Okay, now there's famine in the land. We know who failed here. It wasn't God failed. They just strayed away from him. So in the midst of all of that, while there's all the rebellion in Israel, here is a person from Moab saying, I want to be with you. I want to do what you do. I want to be a part of your people. I want to serve your God. That means abandoning everything that was. So again, in types, in symbols, kind of Ruth symbolizes what should be the person here in this world. That when we come to the person of Jesus Christ and we dedicate ourselves to him, and we accept his work in our lives for forgiveness of sin, we recognize his sacrifice on our behalf, and we believe in him for what he offers to us, it really is an abandoning of everything, what we formerly believed, who we formerly were. What Paul would tell us, that anyone that is in Christ is a new creation, and all those former things have passed away. Past tense, they're gone. Okay. With that as the understanding, we can see, okay, Ruth kind of really is a good indication of what should be the life of every believer, that there's no looking back to where we had gone. Though there is an uncertainty of what it is that we've just come into, we know that we are leaving and we are abandoning everything that has been. That should be the life of the believer, every believer. Okay, so we start to see it. So let's look at the various pieces of this again. Entreat me not to leave you. So Ruth really realizes, don't cast me off. Let me stay with you no matter what. Or to turn back from following after you. Don't force me to go back where I've come from. Nothing indicates that it was a bad situation that she came out of. She just wants nothing to do with it. She wants to go, even in the uncertainty, thinking, I'm going with a widowed mother-in-law. I'm widowed as well, going to a land that there's some real, there's friction that's been there for hundreds of years. I'm probably not going to be welcome there, but she still persists. No matter what the cost, I want to go. And so she says, This is her way of acknowledging, I'm going to leave everything behind. Wherever you go, I will go. You are the one who will take the lead. Where you lodge, I will lodge. I will live where you live. And your people will be my people. I will leave my life of being a Moabite to become everything that it means to be an Israelite. And then your God will be my God. She goes on to say this, where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. The Lord do so to me and more also. What an amazing thing. So that is, I'm not even going to be buried. That phrase that we see so often with Israel is that they were buried with their fathers. It means that the place of their inheritance, their heritage, where they grew up, the land where they had come to know themselves. Well, she wants nothing to do with Moab at this point. And again, we're not told why. We just know that she is dedicated to Naomi, and she's dedicated to do this. This will be the rest of her life, and she recognizes that. So she says all of these wonderful things. And so, again, to finish off what we see in verse 17, where you die, I will die. When your life comes to an end, that's where my life will come to an end as well, and I will be buried there. So the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you from me. Wow. I mean, remember what predicated this. This is on the heels of Naomi saying, why would you want to go with me? Basically, I'm a widow. You're going to be a widow as well. And so go back. You have a life that you can still live. You're young enough. You can start over again. And basically she says, everything about what was is now gone to me. It's such a profound thing that is said here and what ends up taking place. And so this is what ends up happening. So this is, let it be, if anything but death parts you from me. And when she saw that she was determined to go with her, she stopped speaking to her, stopped trying to. It's not like she gave her the cold shoulder. It's just, okay, I'm not going to try to convince you otherwise. So in verse 19, so then the two of them went until they came to Bethlehem. And it happened when they had come to Bethlehem that all the city was excited because of them. And the women said, is this Naomi? And so the recognition, this is kin. These are people, when they look at Naomi, she's from here. Again, 10 years plus by this time that they had been there. And now she's returned back home. There's still that recognition that's there. And they welcome them in. Here's Naomi's take on this. But she said, do not call me Naomi. And that means pleasantness. And that means, she's pleased. And or her name meant pleasantness or delightfulness. And she says, that shouldn't be my name anymore, but my name should be changed to Mara, for God has dwelt bitterly with me. And that's what Mara means, is bitter. Now notice she says, this is what God has done to me. It's that whole thing about I blame him. And so he's the one who has done this. Now, there's two ways you can look at that. She could be saying here, God has caused this to happen to me, or God has allowed this to happen to me. But in either way, she realizes that God could have intervened. And yet he didn't intervene, and her life is what it is. And so she says, my name should be changed from delightfulness or pleasantness to bitterness because of all of what happened to me in Moab. Once again, if God had his say in this, he would have said, what are you doing in Moab? Very similar, I think it's kind of what happened with Elijah. When Elijah had his whole thing with the prophets of Baal, and Jezebel says, I want his head on a plate. And basically he runs from her. Runs about as far as you can run. So if you know where Carmel is, we're talking about way up here in the north along the coast, the Mediterranean coast. He runs as far down as Beersheba, way, way down into the south. Pretty much the last of civilization in Israel is the south, Beersheba. And he went even further from that when God says, what are you doing in this cave? So there are those times when it's that woe is me. And God basically has to say, well, why are you here in the first place? I didn't tell you to come here. I didn't drive you to this place. So whether it's Elijah, what are you doing here? I didn't ask you to come here. Or if it's Naomi, well, look at what happened to me when God sent us or made us, or somehow we wound up in Moab. God would have said, I had nothing to do with that. So that blame goes solely on you and your husband. And all of that calamity is because of your decisions, but the decisions of the nation as a whole during the Judges was clear that there was a place of rebellion. Now, again, there were still faithful people still in Israel, though the nation had turned its back. So isn't this an interesting kind of juxtaposition? The nation is falling further and further away from God and Israel, but here is this pagan woman wanting to leave her paganism behind and come into the land of the people of God and to make God Jehovah her deity, her God, unlike the idolatry that she was leaving behind. It's a pretty amazing thing. So, in verse 21, she says, I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home again empty. And so do you call me then Naomi, since the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me? Again, she keeps seeing. It doesn't really go into whether or not she sees this as a just, as she sees it, punishment, or if she thinks that God deals punitively with her. So let's tackle that too, because it's really important. Every action has consequence. There's no doubt about it. And so what we are promised as believers is not simplicity in this life. It's not an ease of life. It doesn't mean that our life is going to be simple by any stretch of the imagination. It just simply means that God will have secured for us what we have in the eternal sense. So any blessing or any cursing, any good things or any bad things that may happen to us in this life are just really for this life only. God does not promise us ease of life and simplicity. We don't get that promise in any way. We do get the promise that there is potential for hardship. But what the promise that overrides them all is that God has given us an eternity wherein we are saved and we are secure, and we will spend that eternity with the God who loves us. So whatever happens here in the temporal sense, excuse me, really is very much for this time. And we should look at it as such. It's not for us to dwell upon what is happening here, day to day, here and now, especially when we start to think, but again, it's relative. I don't care how bad your life here in the West may be. Try being a Christian in other places in the world where they could kill you if they find out that you are a professed believer, and then go ahead and talk about how difficult your life is here in the United States. I mean, perspective is a good thing to understand and seeing the big picture. So, this idea that God has afflicted me, we want to make sure that we are very careful not to blame God and point the finger at him for every difficult thing, because God does not deal with people in the punitive sense. He's just, and he's a judge. There's no question about that. But we would never say, he picks on me for no good reason. He's punitive. He does things out of spite and anger and jealousy and all. That is not the God of Scripture. So the accusation, if that's her intent, is completely off the mark. But then again, sometimes situations will really cause people to say things that if they had really thought about it, they might have said otherwise or a different way. So it's important to recognize when you see these kind of things in the Scriptures, it is good for us to say, let's make an application to this. When difficulties come into our life, we're going to find oftentimes, almost invariably, they are brought about because of bad decisions on our part. Not because God told us to do something, but we, by our own reasoning, thought it would be the best course of action, and it blows up in our face. We should be careful not to point the finger at God. Well, why didn't you intervene? Because God will say, well, why'd you do that in the first place? I didn't advise you to. God didn't tell him to go to Moab. God didn't tell him to, the whole nation to rebel against him, that he would allow a famine to come into to that part of the world anyway. That's God basically saying, look, you want to reject me? Don't expect my covering. You're kind of left to your own devices, and this is what happens. So again, you can see it's kind of just a cascading effect of one bad decision leads to another, to another, to another, and then there's nothing but difficulty. And in the midst of all of that, God is able to do this incredible, miraculous thing, and it's recorded for us that we can see that in the midst of even tragedy, God can make something good that takes place out of it if the people have their focus in the right place. Chapter 2 is going to bring again a lot more types and symbolic things that will help us in our understanding of it. So verse 22 tells us, so Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and now they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. So this tells you about what time of year it was. and it sets up nicely for where we get to in chapter 2. We get that there was a relative of Naomi's husband, a man of great wealth in chapter 2, of the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz. And so we find out that this is the place where Ruth says, well, look, it's the barley harvest, and according to the law, there was supposed to be the outer portions of the fields that were left for the gleanings of the people who didn't have anything. They had no inheritance. They didn't raise crops. The people who owned the land where they raised the crops were supposed to leave the corners untouched so that there could be gleaning. So at least this part was still being accepted in those days. And that's the setup for chapter 2, because now it's going to introduce to us Ruth, Boaz becoming this very, very important figure in the book of Ruth. And we'll pick that one up next week because it's going to take quite a while to go through. And I do want to look at the symbols. Let me make sure I'm very careful about this. Some people, I believe, at times, especially in books like this that may have a lot of symbols and types, sometimes will read more into it than they probably ought to. I think it'll be good to look at the various types that we have here, and we can draw some conclusions from it, not go too far with it, because what is clearly presented to us here, like this kinsman redeemer, we will have Boaz, and they'll say Boaz is a type of Jesus Christ. But the relationship that he has with Ruth and with Naomi is different than what Jesus has with the church. What they both are is an Old Testament person that was told in the law that a person was able to redeem those things that belonged to somebody of their kin or of their family. So where Boaz serves as that Goel, the kinsman redeemer, so does Jesus as the avenger of blood for us, the Goel, and it is an Old Testament book of the law kind of a thing. And we'll go through all of that and those types and the importance of it, and we'll look at the New Testament applications of it. But we want to make sure that we don't take the symbolism so far that we read more into it than what it actually is. And I'll explain all of that as we get to it. So again, keep the map that I'm going to give you, keep that handy. And I'll look also if I can find something that I'm really satisfied with. I'll look for some charts of the parallels of the types and the symbols before next week's program. And I'll have those ready for you as well. If I can find some, I think again sometimes they just go a little too far, but we can get some good references when we start to look at the symbols or the types, and see how there's good application in the New Testament sense. So all of that will make sense when we get there. We'll pick up at chapter 2 next week, and we'll see where it goes from there. Until then, I pray that God blesses your time as you study His Word, and that He grows you in your faith in Jesus Christ.